It's strange how quickly peace can turn into chaos. One moment, I was sitting on my porch, sipping coffee while my daughter laughed in the yard, her golden hair catching the sunlight like it was spun from hope itself. The next moment, I heard the sound of tires crunching gravel, heavy boots hitting the ground, and the cold crackle of radios. My stomach sank before I even saw them. 3 police cruisers lined up at the edge of my driveway, doors opening in sync like a rehearsed performance, followed by black-suited lawyers climbing out of sleek cars. My wife stepped outside, holding our youngest on her hip, her face tight with worry. She whispered, "What's happening?" And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was war. The HOA had finally made its move. For months, they'd been circling me like vultures, sending notices, threats, fines that made no sense. They claimed my fence was too high, my barn too old, even that the wildflowers in my yard didn't fit the community's aesthetic. Each letter came with more venom than the last, but I ignored them, because deep down, I thought reason would prevail. After all, I owned this land. Every inch of it was mine, bought fair and square long before this neighborhood association decided they could govern my life. But standing there, as cops placed their hands on their belts and lawyers adjusted their ties, I realized they weren't here to talk. They were here to break me. My daughter's laughter faded. She clutched the porch railing, eyes wide with fear. My wife's knuckles turned white around the baby. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, but I forced myself to breathe steady. Fear was what they wanted. Control was what they craved. The lead officer stepped forward, a tall man with a face hardened by years of authority. "Sir," he called out, his tone flat but firm, "we've received multiple complaints. The HOA board has filed injunctions and we have legal orders to inspect your property today. I suggest you cooperate." Behind him, the HOA president herself stood smugly in her pressed suit. Karen Miller. Everyone in the neighborhood knew her. Name, her rules, her hunger for power. She didn't even try to hide her smirk as she scanned my home like she already owned it. "You've had plenty of warnings," she said sharply. "This ends today." I clenched my fists. "This is my land," I said, voice shaking but strong. "You have no right." Karen's eyes gleamed like she'd been waiting to hear those words. She motioned to the lawyers, who quickly pulled out folders and waved documents in the air. "Oh, we have every right. You signed the HOA agreement, and you violated nearly every section. We'll fine you, sue you, and if you resist, you'll lose everything, your choice." The air grew heavier, the silence pressing in on me. My wife stepped closer, whispering, "Please, don't let them take us down like this." And in that moment, I made a silent promise. They wanted me scared, broken, cornered. But I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Because what? They didn't know, what none of them could possibly guess, was that I had been keeping records. Every shady demand, every false fine, every illegal action they tried to slip past me. I had a mountain of evidence locked away safely, and today might just be the day I let it out. But I couldn't show my hand yet. Not when my family was trembling behind me and half the county's law enforcement stood at my gate. So I forced a tight smile and said, "You want to inspect? Go ahead. But remember this moment." The lead officer narrowed his eyes, perhaps sensing something in my tone, but he gestured and the group moved past me. My daughter whimpered and I bent down, touching her shoulder. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered, though my own heart was breaking. "Daddy's got this." As they spread across my land, snapping pictures, scribbling notes, my blood boiled. These weren't just inspections. They were vultures circling a meal. They pointed at my barn, at the shed my father built with his own hands before he passed, away, at the swing set I'd built for my kids. Every laugh, every memory, every ounce of sweat poured into this land, reduced to violations on a clipboard, and Karen walked among them like a queen inspecting her conquered territory. Watched my wife's face as she held the baby close, her eyes glassy with tears. She mouthed, "What do we do?" And I wanted to tell her everything. That the evidence I had was ironclad, that the same greed fueling Karen would destroy her in court, that I would see justice. But for now, I only said, "Trust me." When the so-called inspection was over, they regrouped near the driveway. One lawyer smirked as he shoved a packet of papers into my chest. "You'll be hearing from us very soon, and unless you plan on paying tens of thousands in fines, I'd advise you to settle." Karen leaned in close, her perfume sharp and suffocating. She whispered, "You should have known better than to fight me." I stared at her, my jaw tight, my fists trembling at my sides. "No," I whispered back, low enough for only her to hear. "You should have known better than to underestimate me." As they drove away, leaving dust and silence in their wake, my daughter climbed into my lap, shaking. My wife sat beside me, her hand clutching mine. And in that quiet, broken moment, I looked at my family, then at the land I'd sworn to protect. The HOA thought they'd just broken me. What they didn't realize was that they'd just given me the perfect chance to strike. That night, the house was silent, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. My daughter had cried herself to sleep, curled tightly against her blanket like she was trying to hide from the world. My wife lay beside me in bed, her back turned, shoulders stiff with the kind of tension that no gentle words could undo. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, my chest heavy with guilt. I had promised them peace when we moved here, a safe home where our children could grow without fear. And now, because of the HOA, because of Karen's unrelenting obsession with control, my family was living in fear under our own roof. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the smug look on Karen's face, the way the lawyers tossed papers at me like I was already defeated. I thought about the police, their hands resting on their holsters, waiting for me to snap. They wanted me to lose it. They wanted me angry and reckless. But instead, they were going to get something much worse. They were going to get patience. They were going to get precision. I rose quietly from bed, careful not to wake my wife, and made my way to the small study at the back of the house. The desk drawer creaked as I pulled it open, and there it was, the thick binder I had been keeping for over a year. Inside were copies of every letter the HOA had sent, each one marked with dates and signatures. Photos of my property, time-stamped, showing their claims were lies. Recordings, yes, recordings, of conversations I'd had with board members, where they made threats they thought would never come back to haunt them. I'd even dug into county records, discovering discrepancies in the HOA's own finances, money that seemed to vanish without explanation. I flipped through the binder, slowly, page after page, and the weight of it felt like justice waiting to be unleashed. My father always told me, "Never pick a fight, son, but if one finds you, make sure you finish it." I hadn't wanted this fight, but it had come knocking at my door, and now it was mine to finish. By morning, my wife found me asleep at the desk, the binder spread open under my arm. She touched my shoulder gently. "You were up all night?" I rubbed my eyes and nodded. "I've been keeping everything, every threat, every false fine. I have proof, all of it." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I thought it was relief. But then she whispered, "I just want them to stop. I don't want the kids growing up in the middle of a war." Her words hit me harder than any fine ever could. She wasn't wrong. What kind of father lets his children grow up in fear? But I also knew that if I didn't stand up now, if I let the HOA bulldoze us, my family would never know peace. Not here, not anywhere. "I promise you," I said, cupping her face. "In my hands, this ends soon. And when it does, They'll never touch us again. The days that followed were tense. The HOA mailed more notices, each one more aggressive than the last. They claimed my shed violated zoning rules, that my dog was a public nuisance, even, that the American flag I flew out front was too large for community standards. Each letter felt like a slap, but I didn't react. Instead, I filed them neatly into the binder, adding fuel to the fire I was building. Then came the court summons, a thick envelope stamped with authority, accusing me of multiple violations, and demanding thousands of dollars in fines. My wife's hands shook as she held the paper. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice breaking. I took the summons from her, my jaw set. "We're going to show up," I said. "And we're going to end this." Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some whispered that I was crazy to fight the HOA, that no one ever won against them. Others gave me sympathetic looks but kept their distance, too afraid to get involved. But one evening, as I worked in the yard, an older neighbor named Mr. Harris shuffled over. He was a quiet man, a widower who mostly kept to himself. He leaned on his cane and said softly, "I heard what they're doing to you. They tried the same with me years ago. Took my savings, nearly cost me my home. But I didn't. Have proof like you. If you've got evidence, don't let them scare you. Make them pay." His words stuck with me. They weren't just about me anymore. This was about every family the HOA had bullied, every neighbor who had lost their peace. Maybe I was the one who had to finally stop them. The night before the court date, I sat with my wife and children. We ate dinner quietly, the clatter of forks against plates louder than any conversation. Finally, my daughter looked up and asked, "Daddy, are the bad people going to take our home?" Her question sliced me open. I reached across the table, taking her tiny hand in mine. "No, sweetheart," I said firmly, my voice steady even, as my chest ached. "They're not taking anything from us, not now, not ever." When I tucked her into bed later, she whispered, "Promise?" "I promise," I said, kissing her forehead. And I meant it with everything in me. That night, as I packed my evidence into a neat stack of folders, I felt the shift inside me. Tomorrow wasn't just about defending myself, it was about standing up for my family, for my neighbors, for everyone who had suffered under Karen's rule. The HOA thought they had trapped me, but tomorrow, in that courtroom, I was going to turn the trap on them. The courthouse smelled of old wood and paper, the kind of place where lives are quietly reshaped without the world noticing. I walked in holding my wife's hand, her grip, firm despite the tremble I could feel beneath her skin. My daughter stayed home with a neighbor, but her last words echoed in my head. "Promise me they won't take our home." That promise was burning inside me as we stepped into the courtroom. Karen was already there, sitting like she owned the place. Her suit was pristine, her hair pulled so tight it looked painful. The HOA lawyers flanked her, briefcases stacked, their smug grins sharp enough to cut glass. They barely looked at me when I walked in, like I was already defeated, like this was just another routine victory for them. The bailiff called the room to order, and the judge, an older man with weary eyes, settled into his seat. Papers shuffled, the air thick with expectation. The HOA lawyer stood, straightening his jacket. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and practiced, "we are here today regarding multiple repeated violations by Mr. Anderson, who has ignored the community's standards and obligations under the HOA agreement. His actions have not only diminished property values, but also set a dangerous precedent for others who believe they can ignore the rules." Karen nodded proudly, as though each word was her personal triumph. I sat quietly, my binder resting on my lap, waiting. The lawyer went on, listing so-called violations: the fence too high, the barn too old, the shed improperly placed, the dog too noisy. He threw in words like reckless and negligent, until even I had to remind myself I wasn't the villain in this. story. My wife leaned closer and whispered, "Don't let them win." When the lawyer finally finished his speech, the judge turned to me. "Mr. Anderson, do you wish to respond?" I stood slowly, gripping the binder like a shield. My voice felt tight at first, but I forced it steady. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." The courtroom quieted. Karen leaned back, crossing her arms, smirking. She thought I had nothing but stubbornness to stand on. I opened the binder and laid the first set of documents on the table before me. For every violation they've claimed, I have proof to the contrary. Photos, dates, county records. Every single fine they issued was either fabricated or based on false information. I slid the photos forward. Images of my fence, measuring. Tape clearly showing it was within legal height. A picture of my shed, time-stamped before their alleged complaint. Even recordings, where HOA board members admitted in private they were targeting me. The lawyer stiffened, flipping through the papers quickly, his confident smile fading. Karen's smirk faltered just slightly, her fingers tightening around her pen. I continued, my voice gaining strength. This isn't just about me, it's about abuse of power. The HOA has been issuing fraudulent fines and harassing families across this neighborhood. I've spoken with others who were forced to pay thousands for violations that never existed, people too scared or too poor to fight back. But I kept everything. And what I have here, I tapped the binder, shows a pattern of corruption. The judge raised his brows, leaning forward. "Corruption, Mr. Anderson?" "Yes, Your Honor." I opened another section of the binder. Financial records, money collected from homeowners unaccounted for. Thousands of dollars missing from the HOA's accounts. Withdrawals made by board members, including the president, with no explanation. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Karen's face flushed crimson. She shot a glare at the lawyers who scrambled to whisper among themselves, flipping through their own folders like they'd suddenly lost the map to their battle plan. My wife squeezed my hand under the table, her eyes wide but shining with hope. For the first time in months, she saw what I saw. We had them. The HOA lawyer tried to recover, standing abruptly. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant to the case at hand. We're here to discuss property violations, not financial management." But the judge's voice cut through his protest like steel. "If there are allegations of financial misconduct tied to the HOA, this court has every right to hear them. Continue, Mr. Anderson." I nodded, flipping to the last section of my binder. "Emails," I said simply, "between board members discussing how to pressure families, talking about targeting certain households to force them into compliance or out of the neighborhood. And here," I held up one printed email, my voice steady but cold, "is a message from Karen Miller herself. It reads, 'If he doesn't, Bend will break him. Send cops, send lawyers, whatever it takes. He'll give up eventually.'" The room went silent, the words echoing like a thunderclap. Karen's jaw dropped slightly before she tried to compose herself. But it was too late. The damage was done. Everyone had heard it. The judge slowly removed his glasses, cleaning them as he looked straight at Karen. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "Ms. Miller, do you have an explanation for this?" Karen stammered, her usual confidence crumbling. That's taken out of context. It's a misunderstanding." I leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "No, it's exactly what it looks like." The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling heavily. "I think we've heard enough for today. Mr. Anderson, submit all of your evidence into the record. This court will review the documents thoroughly. In the meantime, I am placing an injunction on any further actions by the HOA against you until these matters are resolved." Relief washed over me like a flood. My wife covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. For the first time in months, we weren't under their thumb. Karen, however, was shaking with fury, her knuckles white around her pen. As the judge adjourned the session, she leaned across the table, her voice low but venomous. "You think this is over? You just declared war?" I met her glare without flinching. "No, Karen. You declared war the day you brought cops to my home. I'm just finishing it." We walked out of that courtroom with our heads held high. My wife's hand in. Mine felt steadier than it had in weeks, but I knew this was just the beginning. The evidence was now in the open, and it was only a matter of time before the HOA's empire of fear came crashing down. The days after the court hearing felt different, like the air in the neighborhood had shifted. For months, it had been heavy, suffocating, filled with fear every time I saw Karen's car roll by or another envelope in the mailbox. But now, for the first time, people looked at me differently. Not with pity, not with that nervous distance, but with curiosity, like maybe I had cracked something they'd all been too afraid to touch. One evening, as I walked back from the mailbox, a woman I barely knew stopped me on the sidewalk. She glanced around nervously before speaking. "I heard what you showed in court. Is it true? About the missing money?" I nodded. "It's all documented." Her shoulders sagged with relief. "They took $5,000 from me last year over some fake landscaping violation. I knew something wasn't right. She wasn't the only one." Over the next few days, neighbors started quietly approaching me. An older couple told me they'd been forced to repaint their home twice in 1 year because Karen claimed the shade was wrong. A young family explained they'd nearly lost their savings paying fines for unauthorized play equipment, just a swing set for their kids. Every story carried the same bitter thread: intimidation, fear, and money stolen, in the name of community standards. The anger was growing, and it wasn't just mine anymore. But Karen wasn't about to let her grip slip without a fight. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, written in her careful, condescending tone. "Do not be fooled by one man's lies. The HOA protects this neighborhood. Without us, your property values will plummet. Stand united or chaos will follow." It was laughable, but I knew the damage those words could do. Fear had always been her weapon, and she was swinging it harder than ever. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with my wife, I could see the worry still etched on her face. She stirred her tea but didn't drink it. What if people believe her? What if this turns them against us? I reached across the table, covering her hand with mine. Then we show them the truth. Not in whispers. Out in the open. Her eyes searched mine, uncertain but hopeful. "You really think we can—" "Bring her down!" I squeezed her hand. "I don't think. I know." The next morning, I started making copies. Photos, emails, financial records, everything I had. I slipped them into envelopes and left them on doorsteps, under welcome mats, even taped a few to mailboxes. By evening, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. Groups gathered on sidewalks, papers in hand, voices rising with outrage. Karen drove past slowly in her silver SUV, her eyes darting side to side, her lips pressed into a hard line. For once, people didn't wave at her. They turned their backs. That night, she showed up at my doorstep. No lawyers, no cops, just Karen standing under the porch light with her jaw clenched. My wife held the baby close as I stepped outside, shutting the door behind me. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed. "Turning people against me, spreading lies." I crossed my arms, meeting her glare. "They're not lies, Karen. They're your own words, your own actions. All I did was hold up the mirror." She took a step closer, her voice sharp. "You have no idea who you're messing with. I built this neighborhood. I hold it together. Without me, it'll collapse into chaos." I leaned in just enough for her to hear me clearly. "No, Karen. Without you, it might finally breathe." Her face twisted with rage, but I didn't flinch. For once, she was the one who couldn't stand the silence. She spun on her heel and stormed off, muttering threats under her breath. Inside, my wife looked at me anxiously. "What did she say?" Nothing. We didn't already know, I answered. But deep down, I could feel it. Karen wasn't done. She was cornered now, and a cornered predator was always dangerous. 2 days later, the retaliation came. A bright red notice was taped to my front door, immediate action required. Property foreclosure proceedings initiated for unpaid fines totaling $48,300. My wife gasped when she saw it. They can't do this. Not after the judge. They can try, I said, ripping the notice down. But this just proves they're desperate. Still, the fear in her eyes cut deep. She clutched my arm, her voice trembling. What if they take the house? What if they take everything? I pulled her close, holding her tight. I won't let that happen. Not now. Not ever. That evening, I called every neighbor who had come forward. We gathered in my barn, the same one Karen had mocked during her so-called inspection. Men, women, even teenagers showed up, the room buzzing with anger and determination. I laid out the documents on a folding table. This isn't just about me anymore, I said, my voice carrying through the barn. This is about all of us. Every fine, every threat, every dollar stolen. They thought we'd stay scared and silent, but if we stand together, they can't bully us anymore. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Mr. Harris, the old man with the cane, tapped it firmly on the floor. Enough is enough. Let's finish this. By the time everyone left, the plan was clear. We weren't just going to fight. Karen in whispers. We were going to drag every one of her dirty secrets into the light at the next board meeting in front of the entire community. As I locked up the barn that night, my wife slipped her hand into mine. You're really going to war with her now? She said softly. I nodded, staring out at the darkened neighborhood. She brought the war to my door. Now I'm bringing it to hers. But even as I said it, I felt the storm gathering. Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And I knew the next battle wouldn't just test my strength. It would test how far she was willing to go to keep her empire of fear intact. The night of the HOA board meeting, the community hall buzzed like a hive about to swarm. People crowded the folding chairs, their voices low but charged, the tension so thick you could almost see it hanging in the air. I sat near the front with my wife beside me, her hand resting on my arm. She was nervous. I could feel it in her. Grip. But there was something different in her eyes tonight. A flicker of hope. Maybe even pride. Karen stood at the head of the room, framed by the American flag and the HOA banner she'd insisted on hanging at every meeting. She was in full armor, tailored suit, hair tight, voice sharp as she called. The meeting to order. Her allies, the board members who'd nodded along to her every command, sat stiffly at her sides, but even they looked uneasy tonight. Before we begin, Karen said, her tone as sugary as poison, I want to remind everyone that the HOA exists to protect our community. Without rules, we'd have chaos. Without order, property values would plummet. We must remain strong, united, and vigilant. Her words used to work. They used to silence the room, scare people into submission. But tonight, murmurs rippled through the crowd. People weren't cowed anymore. They were restless, waiting. Karen's smile flickered. Now, on to business. I stood. My voice cut through the room like a blade. No. Tonight isn't business as usual. Tonight we talk about what you've been hiding. The room erupted with whispers. Karen's eyes locked on me, cold and furious. Mr. Anderson, you are out of order. Sit down or I will— You'll what? I stepped forward, holding up a thick folder. Send more cops to my house? More lawyers to my door? Threaten foreclosure with fake fines? We're done being afraid, Karen. Tonight, everyone here gets to see the truth. I opened the folder and began handing out copies, photos, emails, financial records. Neighbors snatched them up, their eyes scanning the pages, faces changing from confusion to anger to outright betrayal. A woman in the back stood up, waving one of the papers. You charged me $800 for unauthorized landscaping, and here it says the board voted to pocket half of it for a so-called maintenance fund. An older man shouted, I paid $3,000 for repainting my house, and now I find out the color wasn't even wrong? You lied to me! The noise grew louder, furious voices clashing as people flipped through the evidence. Karen's face drained of color, then flushed red as she banged her gavel on the table. These are lies, all of them. Fabrications meant to stir chaos. I lifted one email high above my head. This is your own message, Karen. If he doesn't bend, we'll break him. Send cops, send lawyers, whatever it takes. That's not protection, that's intimidation, that's abuse. Gasps rippled through the hall. People turned on Karen, eyes sharp, voices rising. The board members squirmed in their seats, avoiding. Her gaze suddenly less loyal now that the tide was turning. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to recover. You don't understand. Without strong leadership, this neighborhood would fall apart. Everything I did was for your benefit. But no one was buying it anymore. A man near the front stood, his voice shaking with rage. For our benefit? You drained our savings, bullied our families, and called the cops on us in our own homes. You're a tyrant, not a leader. Applause broke out, scattered at first, then growing until it filled the hall. People weren't afraid to speak anymore. They shouted their stories, their anger pouring out like floodgates breaking. Karen's gavel slammed again and again, but no one listened. The board members whispered among themselves, and one of them, a younger man with tired eyes, finally stood. He cleared his throat, voice trembling. I can't do this anymore. He's right. The fines, the threats, it went too far. We followed Karen because we were scared too. But I'm done. I resign. The room fell silent for a heartbeat, then exploded with cheers. Another board member stood, then another. 3 of them resigned on the spot, leaving Karen isolated, standing alone at the head of the room. Her hands shook as she gripped the gavel. This is mutiny, she spat, her voice shrill. You'll regret this, every single one of you, but... The crowd didn't back down. They surged forward, not with violence, but with unity, their voices loud and firm. Enough is enough! Step down! I looked at Karen, her face twisted with rage and desperation, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt pity. She had built her power on fear. But the moment that fear vanished, she had nothing left. This isn't mutiny, I said calmly, my voice carrying over the shouts. This is justice, and it's only the beginning. The court has everything. Now! The police have everything. You won't just lose your seat, Karen. You'll answer for every dollar you stole, every family you hurt. Her eyes widened, the first flicker of real fear breaking through her mask. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The gavel slipped from her hand, clattering onto the table. The meeting ended in chaos, not the chaos Karen always warned about, but a righteous storm of voices demanding change, demanding accountability. People left buzzing with energy, no longer shackled by silence. For the first time, the neighborhood felt alive. As we walked home, my wife slipped her arm through mine. You did it, she whispered. You gave them their voices back. I nodded, but inside, I knew it wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to slink away quietly, and the evidence I'd unleashed wasn't just neighborhood gossip anymore. It was a case that could send her and her cronies to jail. The war wasn't finished. But for the first time, I knew we weren't fighting alone. The night after the court hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every word, every look of fear on the HOA board's faces when the judge had exposed their lies. You'd think that moment would have brought me peace. But instead, it lit something else inside me. Resolve. This wasn't over, not even close. Because while the court had humiliated them, they still had power. their allies in the county, the smug neighbors who whispered behind our backs, the lawyers who thought they could twist the law, all of them were still out there, waiting to strike again, and I wasn't going to let them. The next morning, I walked outside with a mug of coffee in my hand, watching the sunlight stretch over my land. The grass swayed with the wind, my kids were laughing on the porch swing, and for a moment, it felt like life was normal again. But deep down, I knew normal was gone. My wife came out, her hand brushing my arm. "They won't stop," she said softly. Her eyes told me she was scared, but behind that fear was fire. She wasn't the type to back down either. "Then neither. Will we?" I answered. 2 days later, I got another letter. Thick envelope, gold seal, the kind meant to intimidate. Inside was a notice. "Failure to comply with HOA code enforcement will result in forced seizure of property." My blood boiled. They hadn't learned a thing. They thought paperwork would scare me, thought stamps and signatures meant power. But what they didn't know was that every letter they sent, every threat, was another nail in their coffin. I had copies, recordings, evidence stacked high enough to bury them all. I drove to town that afternoon, parked in front of the sheriff's office, and walked inside. Sheriff Dan, a man I'd known for years, looked up when I entered. "Heard you gave those HOA lawyers hell in court," he said with a smirk. "They're not done," I told him, pulling out the thick folder I carried under my arm. "But neither am I." I laid it on his desk, watching his brows furrow as he flipped through. Photos of board members trespassing on my land, audio of their threats, copies of their fake fines and forged signatures. He looked up at me, his expression hardening. This isn't just harassment. This is criminal." That's when I told him about the cops they sent. Badges flashing, hands on their guns, siding with the HOA's lawyers like they were hired muscle. Dan leaned back in his chair, silent for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. "All right, let's do this the right way, but you need to be ready. Once we pull the trigger, there's no going back." That night, I sat my family down at the dinner table. My kids were confused, too young to understand fully, but they saw the worry in their mother's eyes. I spoke carefully, making sure they knew we'd be safe, but also making them understand that standing up for ourselves meant fighting harder than ever. My wife reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "We're with you," she said, and in that moment, I realized something. The HOA wasn't just messing with me. They were messing with all of us. And I wasn't just fighting for land or peace anymore. I was fighting for my family's dignity, their future. A week later, subpoenas went out. Court orders, arrest warrants. The HOA board didn't see it coming. They strutted around like they were untouchable. But when the sheriff's deputies rolled into the subdivision, knocking on doors, reading charges out loud, neighbors came out to watch. The same people who once sneered at me were suddenly whispering, gasping as the so-called leaders were led away in handcuffs. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, misuse of funds. It was all there. But the most satisfying moment came when 2 of the cops who had stood on my porch, threatening me in front of my kids, were brought in too. Turns out, they weren't even acting. Under official orders. They had been on the HOA's payroll, taking bribes to intimidate residents. Seeing them stripped of their badges, dragged out with their heads low, it was justice like I'd never tasted before. The lawyers? They tried to slither out of it, of course, filing motions, spinning excuses. But I had them cornered. Recordings of meetings where they promised to crush me in court. Emails showing they knew about the forged documents. By the time the judge was done with them, they weren't just losing cases, they were losing their licenses. But here's the thing. Even as victory piled up, even as neighbors came to me apologizing for ever doubting me, I didn't feel relief. Not yet. Because justice isn't just about punishing the guilty, it's about healing the wounds they caused. And my family had scars now. My kids jumped every time a car slowed in front of the house. My wife still flinched when official-looking letters arrived in the mail. The HOA had stolen our peace, and I wasn't sure if we'd ever truly get it back. That night, sitting alone on the porch, I made myself a promise. This fight wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about making sure no one else would ever go through what we did. If that meant dismantling the HOA entirely, exposing every rotten corner of it, then so be it. Because sometimes justice isn't served in a courtroom. Sometimes it's served when the whole world sees the truth. And I was about to make sure the world knew everything. The night before the final hearing, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, but my chest felt heavy, like I was carrying the weight of every insult, every threat, every sleepless night the HOA had forced on my family. I walked outside into the cool night air, the moon shining over the land they had tried to take from me. This place wasn't just dirt and grass, it was my father's legacy, the soil where my children played, the safe haven we had built together as a family. They wanted to strip that away, to humiliate me, to break me. But now, standing there with the evidence ready and the law on my side, I knew tomorrow wasn't just about justice. It was about closure. The courthouse was packed the next morning. Neighbors filled the benches, some out of curiosity, some out of guilt, and some, I think, because they wanted to see if the HOA would finally fall. The air was tense, like the whole town had been holding its breath for months and was ready to exhale. My wife squeezed my hand before I walked to the front. She whispered, "End this," and I nodded. The judge entered, and the hearing began. The prosecution laid out everything: financial fraud, bribery, abuse of power, harassment, conspiracy. Page after page, recording after recording, piece by piece, the entire rotten system unraveled in front of everyone. The HOA board members sat pale and sweating, their lawyers scrambling but finding no foothold. Then came the part I'd been waiting for: the videos. On the screen, the jury watched as the so-called cops, the ones the HOA had sent to intimidate me, threatened me on my porch. You could hear my daughter crying in the background. You could hear my wife's voice trembling as she begged them to stop. And then you could hear the lawyer laughing in the background saying, "He'll fold. They always fold." The courtroom fell silent, the kind of silence that feels like a storm about to break. When the video ended, I stood up. The judge gave me a nod to speak, and I turned to face the room. My voice was steady, but my hands were clenched so tight my knuckles turned white. For months, they tried to break me. They sent threats, fake fines, cops with guns, lawyers with papers. They didn't just attack me, they attacked my family. My children still wake up crying at night because of what they did. My wife still looks over her shoulder when a car slows down by our home. This isn't just about property. This is about abuse of power. And today, it ends. When I sat down, I saw tears in my wife's eyes. But this time, they weren't from fear. They were from pride. The verdict didn't take long. Guilty, on all counts. The HOA board members were sentenced: fraud, forgery, conspiracy. Some faced years in prison. The corrupt cops lost their badges and were charged as well. The lawyers, disbarred and fined. But the most powerful moment came when the judge delivered his final words. This court recognizes the danger of unchecked authority in private associations such as this HOA. Let this serve as a warning. No one is above the law. The courtroom erupted. Some clapped, some cried, and I just sat there, breathing in the moment, feeling the weight I had carried for so long finally begin to lift. That evening, I drove back home with my family. The sun was setting, casting golden light over the fields. For the first time in months, the laughter of my kids sounded free, not nervous, not forced. My wife leaned her head on my shoulder as we walked up the porch steps. "It's over," she whispered. I nodded, but inside I knew it was more than just over. Something had changed. The neighbors who once whispered against me began stopping by with casseroles, handshakes, apologies. One old man from down the street looked me in the eye and said, "You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for all of us." And he was right. The HOA wasn't just gone. It was dismantled, dissolved by court order. Every family in that subdivision was free. Free from fines, free from harassment, free from fear. That night, I sat on the porch again, the stars scattered across the sky, my wife's hand in mine. I thought about all we'd endured, the humiliation, the anger, the nights I wanted to give up. And then I thought about the victory, not just in court, but here, in my own home, with my family safe and our dignity restored. Revenge is sweet, yes, but justice, real justice, that's sweeter, because it doesn't just punish the guilty. It heals the broken. And as I closed my eyes, listening to my kids' laughter echo from inside the house, I knew one thing for sure. They would never touch us again. Not here, not ever.